This is Choose the Bear, where we dive deep into the power and joy of living a vibrant, independent life on your own terms. This podcast is your go-to source for smart, fun, and insightful conversations about what it means to embrace independence and live the life you choose. I'm Kat Calvin, and together we'll explore how this movement is challenging outdated stereotypes, redefining success, and empowering people to live their best independent lives. Today is a great day if you are, like me, a research and data nerd who really wants the numbers more than the stories. I know, it's not many of us, but for those of us who are out there and we're like, I don't want the anecdotes. I just want to know what the graph says. Show me a spreadsheet. Today is the day. We have two really, really brilliant researchers and professors, Watling Neal and Zachary Neal, and they are really blazing a trail when it comes to researching child-free people. Yes, people are researching us. How exciting. And wow, the numbers they've come up with. I mean, I read every study of theirs that I could find before this conversation, and my mind was really blown. And I think yours will be when we have this conversation and we talk about how many people are child-free and what that looks like and attitudes towards child-free people and parents and et cetera. And, you know, the reason that I love data and why it's so important is as an activist and a person who works in policy and tries to get laws passed, I know that these are the kinds of numbers that actually make change. And when we're talking about having more political influence for single people and child-free people, the type of research that the Neals are doing really, really shows why that is not only possible, but really probable, and particularly giving shifts and changes. I mean, just wait till you get to the part about numbers changing after Dobbs, et cetera. It is so fascinating. This conversation was amazing. I'm going to set a Google alert for the Neals so I know when they come out with new research, because it is really, truly fascinating and important, very, very, very important for everyone in this country, regardless of what your sort of status or demographic is. So I really hope that you enjoy this conversation. Hello, everyone. So I'm excited because I am a data nerd, and B, one of the things that I started looking into a few years ago was, where's the research on like people who don't have kids? Like nobody ever talks about us. We're just invisible. And I found the people. I'm so excited. I am here with Doctors Zachary Neal and Watling Neal, who are amazing researchers focused on child-free folks. And then, as we'll see, their research actually covers a bunch of other areas that are really, really relevant to the conversations that we're having on this podcast. So I'm so excited. Zachary and Jennifer, thank you so much for being here.
I'm really excited to be here with you, Kat.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Kat.
Yeah, of course. So let's just start with both of you just telling us a little bit about who you are, what you do.
Sure. Well, I am currently a professor of psychology at Michigan State University, but I've worn a lot of different disciplinary hats over the years. I did graduate school in sociology. I've done a bit of geography and so now I find myself in a psychology department. Most of what I research is social networks, how people interact with each other, and sort of statistical models, how we can understand those. But I don't know, about 5 years ago, I started collaborating with Jenna on, investigating this child-free population. It was interesting, it was understudied, and it's sort of taken off as a new research area for me.
Yeah, and I like Zach. I'm also a professor of psychology at Michigan State University. Unlike Zach, I've always been a psychologist. So I went to graduate school in psychology and stayed in psychology. But I love to dabble in different disciplines like him. So I've often incorporated sociology and education in my work. Much of my research has also been on social network analysis. I typically focus on the K-12 educational context. So I've looked at things like how kids' networks in classrooms are linked to their aggressive prosocial and academic behaviors. And I've also looked at how teachers' advice networks are related to their adoption of evidence-based practices in the classroom. But like Zach, I became really interested in understanding the child-free population. And over the last 5 years, we've really been delving into that topic, and it's very exciting.
It's really exciting. And one of the stats, and for everyone listening, I will probably link too many things in the show notes because there's so many interesting studies and things like that. But one of the things you found that I thought was interesting and also really important for sort of ways that we're thinking about sort of politics and policy, et cetera, that we can get into, is that you found that 1/5 of American adults are child free, which is really a big number. So can you talk a little bit about how that number has changed over time, what some of the factors are behind that change, and what you think some of the implications are?
Sure. So this 1/5 number, 20% that we came up with, I think we published that research a couple years ago now, but it got a lot of press because it was much bigger than people were sort of expecting. The number of people that were child free, that didn't want kids, and that number comes from the research that we had been doing focused on adults in the state of Michigan, and we first collected that data sort of at the beginning of the pandemic, sort of early 2020, and found this astonishingly large number and started collecting this data every couple months to see if it was changing, if it was relatively stable. And we started to see some patterns. It was stable for a while, hovered around 20%. We've seen it increase a bit. And we've started looking at some data that comes from beyond Michigan so that we can, start to think about, is this sort of a general American pattern? And so we've also looked at, so there's some really interesting data that gets collected by the CDC called the National Survey of Family Growth, and they see the same kind of thing. So their percentages are a little bit smaller than ours. In the most recent wave, they put it at about 10% of women are child free, but they see, just like we do, that these numbers are going up over time. And so, depending on how the data gets collected and when it gets collected, the types of questions, you get different numbers. But one of the things that's been consistent across all of the different surveys and data sources we've seen is that these numbers seem to be going up. Mm-hmm. The thing that's tricky to pull apart, and we're not quite sure now, is what does it mean that we see these numbers going up? One possibility is that there actually are more and more people saying, I don't want to have kids. Another possibility, though, is that people feel more comfortable telling interviewers, telling researchers, responding on surveys that they don't want to have kids, that they've always not wanted to have kids, but maybe in the past they've said, well, I'm not sure, right, maybe in the future, but now they actually feel comfortable saying, no, I don't want kids. And so we see this increase, but it's sort of hard to tell what's going on there.
Mm-hmm. And actually, can we step back a second and can you talk about how you define child free so that we're all on the same page with that?
Sure. Yeah, so we actually used 3 different questions in our initial Michigan surveys to define child-free people because we wanted to really pull them apart from other types of non-parents. A lot of times in survey research, non-parents just get lumped together as one big group, just people without kids, and that's all that's measured. But we know there's a lot of variation. There's child-free people who don't have and don't want kids, so it's a definition that we were using. And there are also people out there who don't have kids, but want to have them in the future. Those would be not yet parents, people who are planning to have kids. There might be people who are undecided that don't have kids and don't know yet if they want them. And there might be people who don't have kids, aren't able to have kids, but really wanted them. So childless people. So in order to tease apart all those different groups, we had three different questions. First, we asked, do you have any kids? And that allowed us to kind of pull out parents from non-parents. But then we asked, are you planning to have kids in the future? And people who said yes to that were not yet parents and got kind of pulled out. People who said they're not sure, we kind of classified them as undecided. And then for the rest of the people, we asked a final question. Did you want, or would you have liked to have had kids? And if people said yes to that, then they were childless. People who said no to all three questions were child-free. So they had to not have kids, not be planning to have kids, and they don't want kids.
Yeah. I mean, and I think it's so important that you did that, because there's such a huge difference between child-free, childless, and unsure. And particularly, I'm thinking, because I come from a politics place, like from a policy background, right? And like, so much of the conversation around people without children is around like IVF, but when we're saying, wait, but 20% of American adults don't want any, like, are actively choosing not to have children, that has to change that conversation. That's a huge percentage of the population. So it's so great that you guys took the time to make that separation very clear.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right, Kat. It's important to separate the child-free from the childless. As we've been able to separate them, one of the things we've seen, so we've talked about there being, around 20% of adults are child-free. When we think about how many are actually childless, it's a very small number. It's actually about 1/3 that. So of this set of people that aren't going to have kids in the future, 3 times as many are child-free. They're doing it by choice than are doing it by circumstance, say something like infertility. So although there's a lot of discussion about infertility and treatments for it like IVF, that's a much, much smaller segment of the population than this set of people that choose not to have children. And so it's surprising that that much bigger segment is the one that never gets talked about.
Well, it is. And I think, it's why your research is really important on that level, but also I think it's so helpful because one of the things that we encounter all the time is people who are made to feel weird or guilty or shamed for not having kids, and that the only sort of acceptable reason might be that you can't. And so hopefully people who see your research, hear this message, can hear like, no, actually, there are way more of us who are just making this choice, and we're a big part of the population. And that sort of validation hopefully is helpful for a lot of people as well. So one of the things you've done some studies about, which I was sort of laughing because I feel like it's something that gets talked about all the time that people feel, and you have this great way of terming it the difference in warmth between parents and child-free people. And so can you talk about what that means and sort of what your research has shown around the warmth that parents and child-free people have for each other and in their own segments?
Sure. We actually looked at warmth in a couple of different studies, and in both of the studies we did, we had very consistent findings. So what we ended up doing is just asking people, how warm do you feel on a scale of 1 to 100 towards people who don't have and don't want kids, and then also to parents? And we repeatedly found that child-free people feel about the same towards each other and towards parents. So they feel the same amount of warmth towards other child-free people and towards parents. But parents actually feel much warmer towards other parents than they do towards child-free people. It's not that they dislike child-free people, but they feel really, really positive towards other parents. So they kind of have this warmth towards other parents, which might lead them sort of maybe not consciously, but might lead them to choose other parents when they're choosing who to kind of hang around with, or those kinds of things, which then might lead child-free people to kind of be excluded. So we found that and thought it was a really interesting finding.
That's one of those pieces of research that surprises no one in a certain category. Like no child-free person is shocked that parents feel warmer to other parents, but it's nice to see it validated. But it also leads to larger implications. So
you did research on child-free people living in family-friendly neighborhoods. And you looked at how both people in neighborhoods and policymakers prioritize different demographics of people. And the thing that really hurt my feelings is that both single people and child-free people were at the bottom of the priority list, and single people were really low on the priority list of people of needs in these neighborhoods. So can you talk about sort of that study and what that looks like, and also why you think, or if you've gotten any research on why single people and child-free people are ranked so low and prioritized so low?
Yeah, so this started, we were initially thinking about, what makes people like their neighborhoods. And so we just asked people in our Michigan surveys, are you satisfied with your neighborhood, with the place you live? And we started to see this pattern that single people and child-free people, or couples without kids, were systematically less satisfied with their neighborhoods than anybody else. And initially, it was sort of surprising. We figured, some people like their neighborhoods, some people don't, but there was this systematic difference. So we wanted to try and figure out what might be going on. And one possibility we thought was that the warmth finding that Jenna had just described. So one possibility is lots of the activities that bring neighborhoods together are focused on kids and parents. So could be schools, could be, neighborhood picnics, things like that. And if parents really like other parents, which is what we've seen, they're going to focus these activities around other parents and around their kids, not necessarily intending to leave out singles and child-free people, but singles and child-free people just don't fit in very well in those events. And so they don't get to know their neighbors as well. When there's, important neighborhood decisions, they don't really have a seat at the table. So we thought the warmth thing could be one piece of it. But we also wondered if there was something sort of baked into the political cake, the way that neighborhoods get run in terms of politics and policy. So we also asked Michigan policymakers, when you're making decisions about neighborhoods in your city, who do you think should take priority in those conversations? And I think this was another one of those findings that sort of surprises no one, but is disappointing to a bunch of us.
Yeah.
The people that they put right at the top of who should take priority are parents, children, and seniors. And then way down at the bottom of this prioritization are couples without children, and even further below that, singles.
Way down.
Way down there. And so we think this is probably part of the reason that these groups are not particularly satisfied with their neighborhoods, because nobody thinks they matter when we think about what makes a good neighborhood. Now, it's a good question why politicians put these groups so far at the bottom. And that's something we're still grappling with. But we see it routinely that these are groups that politicians just don't like to talk about. They're not featured in policy discussions. Often, even their existence is not acknowledged by politicians. Politicians do not want to acknowledge that people don't want to have children, that there are, a lot of them.
Yep.
And so, yeah, they just get left out of these conversations routinely.
Yeah, I mean, it's why I was so thrilled by your first finding, is because we're very invisible. And so one of the things though that came to my mind when I was reading this neighborhood study was, do you have a sense of sort of what particular things singles or child-free people are looking for in a neighborhood? Is it just that sort of like community factor and being invited to the parties or whatever? Or are there specific things that we should be thinking about when we're planning neighborhoods that would make life more enjoyable, easier, whatever, for single and child-free people?
Yeah, so in that study, we were just asking whether they were satisfied, but we didn't have a chance to ask them what would make them satisfied. In some of our other work, we found that there's just, in terms of demographics, in terms of politics, in terms of personality, in terms of lots of different things, child-free people look a lot, look very similar to other people. And so it's possible that they want to get a lot of the same things out of their neighborhood. They want safe neighborhoods, they want transportation accessibility, they want, restaurants and shops and things like that. So it's possible child-free people don't necessarily want completely different things out of their neighborhood. They just want to be visible members of the community. But yeah, it's a good question, and we haven't been able to get to the bottom of it, whether they really want different things out of the places they live.
Yeah, I also suspect that a lot of things in neighborhoods, like if we think about neighborhood events, are organized around parents and kids, and child-free people don't necessarily have a place in those types of things. So if there is a picnic, it's sort of organized with jumping castles and things for kids, which is great. I'm not saying they shouldn't have those events, but if there aren't also events that are really focused on adults, that could be contributing.
Yeah. I mean, just have an open bar at the picnic, and then both sides are happy, and probably the parents too. So let's talk about Dobbs, because I think, I don't know, I keep saying this. I was really, everything in all your studies, I had just had so many highlights, but this really surprised me. So you found that a Michigan adult was 33% more likely to be child-free after Dobbs. That I think, I mean, it's another thing where it's both shocking and not. Like, that's a huge number. And I think, we're a few years past Dobbs now. We knew that maybe people would be making decisions. You see the sort of articles about like, well, I decided to get a vasectomy, but 33% is massive. Can you talk about that study and what you found?
Yeah. So as Zach mentioned earlier, we had been for a couple of years just collecting data in Michigan on who was child-free, so trying to get prevalence rates. And it turns out we were collecting that data right over the period when the Dobbs decision came down. And we realized we had data pre and we had data post, and it was sort of this way that we could kind of test to see, did Dobbs kind of change anything? And it turned out that it did quite a bit, as you mentioned. So in Michigan was also a really interesting case, because in Michigan, there was significant confusion about the legality of abortion right in the aftermath of Dobbs. There was a 1931 zombie law that was on the books that outlawed abortion in almost all cases. And when Roe v. Wade came down, that, of course, was sort of overruled, but it just sort of stayed on the books. Yeah. So then when Dobbs came down, and it was sort of unclear if abortion was still legal. And there were multiple conflicting court decisions that were kind of coming down during the period right after Dobbs. And that's right when we were collecting some of the data that we had on the prevalence of child-free folks. So we had data from September 2021 and April 2022, which were before the Dobbs decision. We also had data from September 2022 and then December 2022. So September 2022, if you think about Michigan's timeline, that's kind of right during the period of confusion when there were lots of court cases kind of going back and forth about whether abortion was legal. By December 2022, voters had voted to put the right to an abortion into Michigan's constitution. So it was, but that had just happened. So it was just slightly after that had happened. So when we looked at the data, we saw that the adults who identified as child-free during that period rose from 21% before the decision to nearly 26% afterwards. So it's that big 33% increase that you mentioned. And that was pretty big. And we think that it may be that when people don't have access to reproductive care, they decide, it's not really worth it to me to have children in a context where I might not be able to get medical care if I needed it. We'd love to be able to, in the future, go back and collect some more data to see now that reproductive care is kind of access to reproductive care is enshrined in our state constitution. Does that make a difference? Do we see the levels kind of go back down to what they were pre-Dobbs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm interested in seeing more studies on this, because again, it feels logical, but also, I mean, the irony, right, of people working so long and hard to get rid of Roe, only for it to result in people being like, fine, I just won't have any kids at all. Even though we know that the highest population of people who seek abortions already have children, So, I mean, it's a little bit of karma, which is great. But, I think thinking about this, and particularly thinking about how Dobbs is now one of the many factors, along with, sort of the economy and so many things that are happening, that are going to increase that 1/5 number. I feel it probably isn't too long before a quarter of American adults are child free. And so when we're thinking about how that impacts policy and the facts that we just talked about, the fact that politicians and policymakers like to pretend that single and child-free people don't even exist. I don't know if you saw, there's a man running for office who borrowed a family because he's single. So he's like borrowed his neighbor's family because you can't even run for office without pretending that you have a family. So what clearly they're going to have to start paying attention because the percentages are so big. What kinds of issues do child-free and single people have that policy makers are going to have to start paying attention to, or should?
Yeah, and I think it's going to become a big issue for politicians because the population of child-free people is big, but it's getting so big that it's going to be eventually impossible for politicians to ignore. They're going to have to start speaking to these folks. One of the issues we've already talked about quite a bit is reproductive rights, and politicians are already talking about reproductive rights a lot. But, at least here in a swing state of Michigan, almost all of the ads about reproductive rights are about protecting IVF, which is not of interest to child-free people. They don't want to become pregnant even through medical intervention. And there's almost no discussion of what it means to protect reproductive rights of people who don't want to have children in the first place. And what that might mean is talking about things that are sort of uncomfortable politically, things like guaranteeing access to or health insurance coverage for sterilization procedures, for permanent methods of birth control. Those things could come into question with, our current Supreme Court composition and decisions like Dobbs, but it's not something that anyone is really talking about. We see the same kind of focus when politicians talk about taxes. They always talk about taxes in the economy. And right now, one of the biggest focuses for both sides is the expansion of the child tax credit. Lots of ads about expanding the child tax credit, about subsidizing child care. And these may be really important things, and they benefit lots of people. They probably benefit the entire population, but they have almost no direct benefit for child-free people, not even in the future, because they don't plan to have kids, in a couple years. And there's very little focus on, say, tax policy that would directly benefit child-free people now. There's a bit of talk about things like, yeah. So they talk about it a bit. They talk about things like the earned incomes tax credit, but that sort of gets pushed aside. That's sort of the tax minutia. The focus is really on child tax credit and child care. And so I think a lot of these things, they're sort of child-free adjacent. They're issues that could matter to child-free people, but the way they get talked about in politics right now are the versions that matter to parents or would-be parents. So they're close, but they're not quite there yet. And they're going to have to figure out how to get there because it's such a big population that they're missing.
Yeah, I mean, we saw this when the stimulus checks come out, and I got, one stimulus check that was enough for like a few bottles of wine from a local wine store to like help the economy. And I was like, I get that parents are getting a lot more money, but if I was getting regular stimulus checks that were more than like $200, it would just all go to the economy because I don't have, and like, I feel like we're so pronatal in our policy thinking, particularly our economic thinking, that we forget that while and I don't think there are any child-free people out there who are saying that parents don't need child tax credits or all these other things. We know they do. But while all of that is going to businesses and products and schools and whatever that are for children, giving child-free and single people tax credits is only going to boost the economy in ways that are also important and aren't needed for children, right? All we do is go out to restaurants and concerts and bars, right? And we support so many different sectors of the economy that parents don't at the same level. And when it's such a huge percentage of the adult population. And we're seeing this globally too, right? And we're seeing global governments choose very different ways for how they're approaching this. It just seems so clear. And I think your research is really what hopefully will help drive this realization that we have to rethink how we think about taxes, how we think about laws, how we think about how we're talking about reproduction. I know a lot of people were really upset with the DNC because the whole conversation around anything to do with being childless or child free was just a very big segment on IVF. And there was zero conversation through the entire convention about people who are single or child free. And then at the RNC, of course, we're all just crazy, evil cat ladies who are going to ruin the world, right? And it was just like, well, where do we belong? Because there are actually, we get totally screwed on our taxes and things like that. And so this research, I think, is so important for helping to change the narrative and the way we see America and the American family and sort of what our priorities have to be.
Well, and I think you really hit on, reproductive rights, taxes, these sort of big picture political policy issues, but even this subtle difference of like the way child-free people spend their time versus parents is, one of the things we hear a lot at our institution. I think almost every organization is constantly talking about work-life balance. Mm-hmm. But in most contexts, work-life balance is code for balancing work and caregiving relationships, mainly for your kids.
And it's work-kid balance.
Exactly. Exactly. And it misses these other things that you mentioned. It misses work wine balance or work hobbies balance or work travel balance. It misses that life includes a whole bunch of other stuff and maybe a much broader range for folks who don't have kids that isn't getting balanced. And that's not really sort of an economic policy issue. It's not a tax issue, but it's this subtle sort of policy that's everywhere and sort of reinforces this focus on kids and caregiving. Yeah.
Well, and you said it with caregiving, right? So my grandmother's 93. She's actually in the hospital as we speak. She's going to be okay. But I am one of the only grandchildren who doesn't have children. And my aunt, out of the 4 daughters, is single and never had children. She's a teacher. And the two of us, my aunt a long time ago and me recently, moved to my grandmother's small town to be able to help take care of her because we could do that, right? I worked remotely, we didn't have kids, this and that. And so my whole life was totally changed and shifted to be able to be a caregiver. And now she's in the hospital and everyone's here, which is great. But when they leave, it will be my aunt and I who are still here taking care of my grandmother. And that is a very big thing. And yet there's no consideration for the other types of caregiving that usually the single childless females in the family end up taking the responsibility for. And, I think that it's so important when we're having these conversations that we're talking about what are all of the different ways that single people, if anyone who's listening and has kids thinks about it, if you have a sibling who doesn't have kids, they're the ones that a lot of the caregiving responsibilities for other members of the family get pawned off onto, And so those conversations, the fact that we didn't have those conversations, especially with a population that is on one hand aging and on the other hand choosing not to have children, the fact that politicians aren't having those conversations yet is it's such a missed, not even a missed opportunity, but a missed need, because it's a real reality for a large percentage, I would guess, of this 20%.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I do think that people who are child-free, people who are single, oftentimes do end up doing a lot more adult caregiving of, elderly family members, just because they do have that flexibility. And you're absolutely right that that's not considered much at all by policymakers.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's so many places that this research can go. Is there anything that you all are working on now, or that you are seeing other people do, other kinds of sort of areas of research that we should be looking out for?
Yeah. So we have a couple of different things that we're really excited about that we're working on and are kind of in the mix. So you had mentioned that child-free folks extend beyond the US. And one of the things we've been doing is looking at child-free folks in other countries. So in the Philippines, we've done a little bit of work with a colleague there, and we found the percent of single women who are child-free has risen dramatically from 4% in 2013 to over 10% in 2022. And we've also been doing some work in Japan. There, we know that there's a falling birth rate that's been in the news a lot. And there we found that over 5% of all Japanese adults ages 18 to 50 are child-free. And it's been increasing by nearly 3% each year. Japan has amazing demographic data, by the way. The government collects this data because of concerns about the falling birth rate. So it's very easy to track child-free individuals using their governmental data. So that's been really interesting. And we're now expanding to look at child-free adults throughout the developing world, including in African countries and Southeast Asian countries. So really looking to see the prevalence rates in those countries as well. So a couple of things in the mix there. We're also really interested in the unique needs for child-free people, their unique financial needs. So we know that most financial advice is designed for parents who need to save for college expenses or maybe want to leave an estate to their children. But there's a lot of people out there who don't ever have kids. And that advice oftentimes doesn't make sense for child-free people. They have really unique needs, maybe for long-term care, really unique needs for maybe wanting to retire early. So we've been kind of thinking a little bit more about that in our work. And finally, we mentioned at the beginning that we're both social network researchers, and we're really interested in child-free people's social networks. And we're collecting some data nationally here in the US, where we'll have social network data for child-free folks and for parents. And we think that as child-free people get older and their friends have children, that might affect how they connect with others. So we're really excited to study that.
Oh man, I have so many things to say about all of those topics, including the last one. So I definitely let me know when the new research is out. I definitely want to have you back. I think this is, it's so important because we need the actual data and research to be able to move policy forward. And that's coming from you guys. So it's critical. I've been talking about the things I've been reading in your study with everybody because it's so interesting. So thank you so much for coming on. I really hope that you come back and we can talk some more because this is really interesting. Thank you for doing this work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing this work to light and giving us a chance to share it.
Yeah, thank you so much for allowing us to share our work.
Of course, anytime.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and of course, leave a review. Until next week, here's hoping you find joy in your solo life.